and welcome again to another Brattleboro Literary Festival Literary Cocktail Hour. I'm Tom Bedell, and although I'm having my usual beer, the cocktail of this hour should probably be a margarita or something with tequila in it, or straight up. Even if we are a few days removed from Cinco de Mayo, as we're here with Ted Genoways to talk about his new book, Tequila Wars, José Cuervo, and the bloody struggle for the spirit of Mexico. Nice play on words there. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you.
Some quick housekeeping notes before we get rolling. You should be able to see a couple of links on your screen. One is called Chat, and you can find further information there and a chance to order the book, which will help support independent bookstores. And you can chat in there. But if you have a question for Ted, and we hope you do, please put that in the Q&A section at any time during the presentation. And there's also a CC, a closed caption link for those who would like to use that. At the end of the hour, we'll leave our QR code up there for those who would like to donate to the festival, and we hope you do. Ted Genoways is the author of 6 books of nonfiction and poetry. He's a contributing editor at Mother Jones and the New Republic, and his work has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, Outside, the Washington Post, and Poetry Magazine. He served as editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review for 9 years, helping the magazine win 6 National Magazine Awards. And he currently edits Switchyard out of the University of Tulsa, where he teaches journalism. You can sample Switchyard at switchyardmag.com. And I couldn't help but notice that Vermont's own Bill McKibben is in a recent issue.
Yeah.
If Ted's Wikipedia entry is up to date, he's won 16 awards for his prose and poetry, including a handful of awards from the James Beard Foundation. And that's before Tequila Wars was even in the running, so I expect you may have to expand the trophy shelf a little bit more soon. Tequila Wars is not a cocktail book. I confess I haven't quite finished it yet, but there's a lot to unpack in it. And the word wars is not used lightly here. Some of the history on Earth is pretty brutal. But you'll learn about José Cuervo, the man and the brand, tequila, the spirit and the town, Mexican history and politics, and in light of current events, a lot about trade agreements kept and broken, not to mention tariffs. So, Ted, welcome again. The floor is yours.
Tom, thank you very much. It's great to be with you all, and thanks to everyone joining and for your interest. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about the history behind the book before talking about the history in the book. The the book for me began even before I was born. My father is a biologist. He studies bats of the New World, and when he was a graduate student and then a postdoc in the late 60s, he traveled frequently to Jalisco, the state that is where Guadalajara and Tequila are located, and he's spent years there studying the bats of that region. Um, the bats are natural pollinators of the endemic agave that grow in the Tequila Valley. And so I, at a point when I was starting to freelance as a magazine writer, I pitched the idea of going and looking at what the tequila industry is doing now to try to improve its sustainable agriculture practices, and specifically to aid the recovery of the migratory bat population that my dad had studied all those years ago. I thought that that would just be a one-off magazine piece. And then it turned into a second magazine piece and a third. And I was quickly realizing that I was obsessed with this region and the culture that surrounded tequila. What I thought I would do then was to do a book about the current state of the industry and about the industry's attempt to respond to its huge success. But for context, the thing that I kept asking everyone was what they could tell me about the history, how the industry had responded to this kind of challenge in the past. What I was told over and over again was that all of the history was lost. Everyone said everything that was recorded before the Mexican Revolution was destroyed by revolutionaries and had been burned intentionally, and that there was nothing before that time. They also said that after the revolution, the people had become incredibly cautious about putting anything in writing, and so everything had been more or less stored in people's memories. And so, for any of the people who were gone, they had taken that knowledge and that history with them. I guess I began to suspect over time that that couldn't be true, that it couldn't be as total a loss as everyone said. Um, so I started with a few kind of obvious places, the town of Tequila, where still a huge portion of tequila is manufactured. It's the home of José Cuervo and Sauza. Herradura is very nearby. I assumed that there had to be something in the local records, and in fact, that was true. There were documents, but scattered and difficult to interpret because of how decontextualized they were. But I gathered all those materials and then started doing the same thing in Guadalajara, the same thing in Mexico City. I was also looking at newspapers and newspaper databases in particular, trying to gather any sort of small scraps of information. What immediately emerged was the realization that Jose Cuervo, who I think many people may not even realize was a real person, but he was not only real, but he was the central figure in the history of the industry, and especially in the 20th century. He took over this distillery that had been a family distillery that had been lost but then regained by marriage. He took it over in 1900 and ran it until his death in 1921. In that time, he built the industry, modernized the industry in all sorts of significant ways, and then he was working on building distribution channels and modernizing in that way when the Mexican Revolution broke out. And so the last 10 years of his life were largely spent trying to defend his business, defend the infrastructure that he had helped to build, against total destruction. One of the sort of headlines that came out of this research was the discovery that Cuervo had proposed to his other tequila makers, to his fellow tequila makers, that they would be able to survive the Mexican Revolution by working together, by pooling their resources and doing away with competition until the war was over. It was an idea that came from his nephew, Juan Beckman, who was the German consul in Guadalajara, and was based on a model that the Germans had followed and were following during World War One, a kind of collective model that would establish vertically integrated monopolies in order to protect key wartime uh, production chains. So they had done it with steel and with sort of other key war material. Cuervo was interested in the idea of doing exactly this with his fellow tequila makers. If my field of agave is burned, we can use your agave. If your distillery is burned, we can use my distillery. We all work together and we all divide up territory, and we agree that we're going to share the costs of shipping to these different places, and we're going to set fixed prices that we all share in equally, and the key realization in all of this was that the Germans are the ones that give us the word for this model, which is cartel. And it is in this context that it is first used in Mexico, talking about this as a system of production and sort of protecting and guaranteeing distribution. So the but at this time, there was nothing illegal about a cartel system, about a cooperative business model. So what the producers did, especially when most of the war had ended in 1917, there were still factions that were fighting around the country, but there was a stable government in Mexico City and Guadalajara. All of the effort was at increasing production and shipping toward the United States, and to try to get into the U.S. as a way of getting to people who could pay higher prices for their product, and where there were just simply more people who could buy. Unfortunately for Cuervo and for his competitors, some of them as well, in 1917, when the Germans approached Mexico about entering World War I on the side of Germany as a way of establishing a threat to the United States that would keep the US from entering the war in Europe, the US responded by going after anyone in Mexico who they considered to have an undue German influence. And that included Jose Cuervo, his nephews, his business, his distribution company. All of everything that Cuervo touched was banned from doing business in the United States. So suddenly, the only way to move his product into the United States was either illegally or through intermediaries. And in fact, very quickly, there was also passed a wartime prohibition act that made it so that the only way anybody could move tequila into the United States was through illegal smuggling. It doesn't appear that Cuervo and Sousa and some of their partners, including the Rosales family behind Herradura, it doesn't appear that they were smuggling themselves, but they did all establish huge warehouses and distribution centers directly on the border. And I mean, less than a quarter of a mile from border checkpoints from Texas all the way over to California. And that was essentially how the industry was rebuilt. And when national prohibition was enacted in the U.S., that only drove up the demand because there was no longer domestic production of alcohol. And I would suggest that maybe we wouldn't know these products, and certainly wouldn't know the name Jose Cuervo, if not for national prohibition. Cuervo had the largest production, had the best distribution channels, and so when there was a sudden demand for illegal spirits in the United States, he was able to transport goods in the largest quantities to the border checkpoints to be carried across by smugglers. Cuervo himself died early in Prohibition, and the cartel that had been established with the other tequila makers unraveled very quickly. And so what ended up happening was a kind of war between the families, and eventually a carving up of territory. The Cuervos essentially, through Prohibition, ruled the West, and California in particular. The Sousas aimed everything toward Texas. And as a kind of coda, it's worth noting when Prohibition ended in December of 1933, and it became legal to export tequila. By then, Cuervo was dead. His widow, Ana Gonzalez Rubio, was running the country, and she trademarked and copyrighted all of the relevant materials in the U.S. in her name and in Jose Cuervo's name. But it was not very long before the United States passed the Narcotics Act. And what that did was essentially revive those smuggling routes. And it is worth noting that the founder of the Gulf Cartel, the largest and oldest narcotics cartel out of Mexico to this day. The founder of that cartel had smuggled tequila for the Salsa family from Tamaulipas into Texas. So um, that's kind of a broad overview of everything that is in the book. Um, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the specific history, any questions that you may have about how the research and writing were taken on. Anything that may interest you, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I think I'm back up on the screen there. Yes, anyone who has a question, please put it into the Q&A. I've got a few myself, though.
Sure.
Yeah, about the research, I mean, the book is exceedingly well researched, and I have to think it was thricely difficult. Um, so the first question is, do you speak Spanish? And
Yeah. So yeah, the research process was painstaking, to say the least. Uh, and I often say that my Spanish is certainly good enough to deal with the documents that I'm getting in the archive and working through. Um, it is often necessary, and I always do work with an interpreter um, to help negotiate access to certain materials.
hmm,
Um, and that has to do with a kind of a knowledge that goes beyond language and is much more cultural and even sort of interpersonal. The 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 collections in tequila, for example, you know, I'm working with local interpreters who know the people who work at the archive and whose families are related to each other and that sort of thing. And so the access is a little bit easier to gain. Cooperation is a little easier to gain. Um, and and then the process for the research, it's kind of all over the map. I mean, one of the collections that I spent years just trying to get access to is the very large and important collection of the Sousa family that is housed in the town of Tequila.
hmm,
Guillermo Erickson Sousa, who's a direct descendant, he's a great great grandson of Zenobio Sousa, the founder of the brand. The brand is now corporate and foreign owned, but Guillermo has his own brand of tequila and lives in the town of Tequila. And after some years of getting to know each other, he eventually granted me the access to the archive. It is a tremendous resource. When I first accessed it, it was also quite disorganized and essentially kept in a storeroom. And so it was in file cabinets, but um, now it's been moved to a climate controlled facility. We're working on getting the materials digitized and cataloged and trying to make them accessible to researchers so that other people have a little easier time of it. That's easier to do with the private collections. The public collections are a fascinating problem all unto themselves. The materials are quite um, extensive, but they are scattered. I mean, in very strange archives. I found some really important materials in the records of the Civic Waterworks in Guadalajara. That turns out to be where all the records of water disputes over
hmm.
land have ended up. Um,
How often did you actually go to the town of Tequila? How much time did you spend there?
I've spent a lot of time there. I mean, yeah, I don't know how many times I've been there at this point, dozens. But and usually most of the trips are a week or 10 days. I have spent as much as a month in tequila at one time. So it's but very often it was a matter of going and getting whatever I could get from one particular collection and then taking weeks or months back home trying to figure out what I had and from that material figure out what the next step in the research was.
Yeah.
And so the process was slow. That from the time that I wrote the first magazine story to the present, the week of the book coming out, has been 12 years, and so
Wow.
it has taken some doing.
Well, one is tempted to ask what your gallonage of drinking tequila was during,
I
but maybe to phrase it more
immeasurable.
genteelly, how many different tequilas did you sample along the way?
Yeah, well, one of the wonderful things visiting these places that many of the descendants are tequila makers still, and have wonderful products that they're producing and are eager to share. And I'm more than happy to share with them. And so um, that last summer when I was finishing the research and was in the Salsa archives, and um, Guillermo Erickson Salsa would have me over almost every night to hear like what the final stages of the research were yielding. And Fortaleza, the tequila that he makes, is one of my very favorites. And so it was not a bad deal to spend essentially every day fitting in the final pieces of the manuscript, and then every night sitting and talking to him about what I'd found while we had a little bit of tequila together.
Yeah,
It
sounds
was great.
nice. Maybe you could explain for us just a little bit, two questions here about
Sure.
the plant and its life cycle and the difficulties that created for early growers,
Yeah.
and also the forms the spirit comes to us in. The difference
Right.
between tequila and mezcal. Is there a difference? And
Right.
and what's the one with the worm? What's the deal with
Right.
that?
You're right. So that's great. Yeah. So the try to do this as systematically as possible. So mezcal is any spirit that's made from an agave of any species. And the origin of tequila is really just as one of the regional mezcals. Um, and the blue agave that the tequila is made from is just the most common agave that grows in the region of tequila, the Tequila Valley. It turns out that the blue agave is a particularly robust and hardy species as well. And so that has allowed the industry to grow and industrialize by planting agave in long, agricultural rows. Most mezcal, it's not entirely the case, but most mezcal is still, dependent on relatively small farms or wild harvested agave of many, many different species. So the first step in kind of formalizing and industrializing tequila was planting and cultivating the blue agave. The problem, first of all, the plant in the wild takes 7 to 10 years to mature. And if you know anything about farming, it's it's often difficult to get a single good year where all the conditions are right. For agave farmers, you're talking about trying to get a decade. And so it is a very challenging plant, and it is highly susceptible to fungal infections, to bacterial infections, to insect infestations. And, a single snowstorm or hailstorm in that decade will kill off the plants. So it is a rough business to be in. The upside is that because of that difficulty, the plant is in demand and generally commands a good price once it's harvested. Um, but one of the problems that's been created is that the industry has sought ways to shorten that life cycle in order to improve your chances of getting through the to the plant's maturity. And one of those things that it's done is started cutting off the flower stalks to prevent the plant from going to seed. The plant sends up rhizomes when you do that that can be harvested and allows the first of all those rhizomes can be replanted, but also they tend to come to maturity in 6 or 7 years as opposed to 10. The problem is they're genetically identical to the mother plant. And if you do this enough times from a small number of plants, you eventually end up with very, very little genetic diversity.
Uh,
And so all of those diseases that the plants are susceptible to, if you get a field that's almost all genetically identical, if one plant is susceptible or contracts a fungal infection, the whole field is going to be wiped out.
yeah.
And so
Didn't early growers have a 12-year cycle to deal with?
it could be, it could, I mean, so there was the early industry, there were different species that were part of it. I mean, this was one of the other things is that really the botany of the agave was not well known and understood until 1905, 1906. And so the early process was essentially like, whatever agave is growing in the valley, we're using to make tequila. And interestingly, there's a lot of focus these days on 100% blue agave tequila, which has its own kind of reasons in the modern world. But when Jose Cuervo died and the inventory of his distillery was made and an estimate of the number of his agaves, there are 4 different species of agave that are listed as being used at his distillery as recently as 1921. So yes, the life cycles of those plants could vary considerably, and they're all harvested by hand. So to this day, so it is all about how the harvesters judge the maturity of the plants, um all the individual conditions will speed or slow the ripening of the plant. It is a tricky business, agave farming.
Okay, I got a couple questions here from
Yeah.
listeners. Here's another growing one from Dean. Thanks, Dean. Thinking about making maple syrup right now. How much agave does it take to make a liter of tequila?
Yeah, so so it depends. It depends on how much what the sugar content of the agave is. Because some plants will, depending on what's in the soil, how much water they're taking on, some will produce a great deal of sugar, others do not. The goal is to raise plants that have a high sugar content, and then I have heard distillers claim you can get 12, 15 liters out of a single agave. And the name of the game, of course, is to increase your production as much as possible. So the people whose agave have a high brick score, they have a high sugar content, um, those are the growers whose agave are most coveted by the tequila producers. And to right now, most of the large producers, there's some mix of land that they own and cultivate themselves and agave that they buy on the open market. Um, so there's a real cyclical nature to all of this too. And you think about it, you plant your agave and are hoping that it's going to mature maybe 7 years from now. But what the demand for agave is 7 years from now, what the demand is for tequila, it's hard to project. So it's a very, very risky business for everybody involved.
Okay, you still haven't told me about the worm.
Okay, so the worm. The worm is a simple thing. Um, in back in the days when there was a lot of variability in the quality of the tequila, and one of the things that you would do is try to find a way to cover the um the imperfections, the impurities, was to add sweeteners. The worm is actually a larva that of a moth that I like I said, these plants are very susceptible to insect infestations. The larva would, and still does, bore into the agave, and it's sucking up all of those sugars, and when you pull out one of these worms, what they call the wisano, um, it is just essentially a little tube full of agave nectar. And so if you drop that into a bottle, it will definitely sweeten what is inside. And if what is inside is kind of rot gut, um, tequila, that it will at least help cover that flavor or and that harshness, and will give it an agave flavor as well.
And what's the tradition of eating the worm? Do they taste like chicken? I mean,
They so I haven't done it myself. I will be honest, but on one of the trips that I was there, a friend of mine who was the photographer on the trip, ate one of the guisanos, and he said it just tastes like agave nectar. It just tastes like getting a mouthful of agave nectar. So he said, it's not bad. It's in fact it's tasty. It's just you got to kind of get over the psychological part of all of this.
okay. So Dean also asks, can you tell us about the history of the tequila families and their philanthropic contributions to the town over the past 150 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're really, I mean, those families are really central to the development of tequila as a town, and probably, the most prominent period that, other than the contemporary period, which I'll talk about in a minute, but in the period where Jose Cuervo was building the business and really trying to sell the citizens of tequila on some of the political goals that he had, which essentially involved keeping Porfirio Diaz in power as the dictator of Mexico, while liberalizing at the state level, and allowing one of his close allies to take over. What Cuervo did was invest heavily in the development of the town of Tequila. And so he brought the railroad to town, brought electricity, but also paved the streets with cobblestone, and built a bandstand in the middle of the courtyard, or in the middle of the square. He installed a parquet floor in the church, and installed a clock in the bell tower of the church, so that people would know when the train was coming and going. And also importantly, brought water to the town fountain, from the headwaters of the Atascua River that kind of trickle behind and are the source of water for the distilleries. He established schools. He established the public laundries, and so it was a real moment of renaissance for the town of Tequila. Now, a lot of that was undone by the revolution. The town of Tequila was attacked 4 different times, and by attacked I mean cannonaded and set on fire, and so the town was in rough shape. But Cuervo and with assistance from the Sausas rebuilt Tequila in 1919.
Well,
And
let me stop you 1 second,
yeah,
because that feeds into another question from Jim Gardner, who
okay.
says, not knowing much about the Mexican Revolution, how did the revolution affect the industry, the tequila industry, practically? And for example, did the war impact growing crops, distribution of the product, workers at the distillery, and so on?
All of that. Yeah, exactly so. And so tequila was largely the industry in the town were largely unaffected by the revolution, aside from the politics. Uh, and the sort of difficulty of trying to sell what is essentially a luxury item in the midst of wartime. And so, it becomes difficult when people have fewer financial resources. But things really got difficult for the industry starting in late 1913, when the first of the revolutionary attacks occurred. And after that, the town suffered, near complete destruction by 1915. Um, in other ways, also, um, the revolutionaries were frequently targeting the tequila makers as sources of revenue. They would come in and demand bribes from them, would raid their coffers, um, and also knowing that they had mounted some form of defense, that they were employing men to guard and protect the distilleries, and had sort of private militias that they had built. Those were also targeted, but not to be able to come in and take the rifles and saddles and to some degree press those men into service. Um, the industry was repeatedly targeted. Cuervo and many of his contemporaries disappeared in 1914. They went into hiding in the spring of 1914 as the forces under Álvaro Obregón and other forces coming the other direction from Pancho Villa were closing in on Guadalajara. And so they disappeared, literally kind of hung out in some huts in the Barranca north of Tequila for months, trying to wait out the siege on Guadalajara. When they eventually came back into the city, um, thinking that the coast was clear, Cuervo was arrested and stood trial as an enemy of the revolution and was eventually acquitted. Kind of an amazing thing. He was acquitted largely on the testimony of Eladio Sousa, who took the stand and was asked the question, is Jose Cuervo a supporter of the revolution or not? And Sousa said, exactly as I just told you, it's like, well, what I know is that your forces came repeatedly into Tequila demanding money. And Cuervo paid the money, as we all did. He paid more than anyone else. So either your revolution was won by bandits who were stealing from people, or he was a supporter of the revolution. And the tribunal decided that Cuervo was a supporter of the revolution and released him. But just within a few months, Pancho Villa took over. By then, the factions were fighting amongst themselves. Villa took over the city, demanded that all the tequila makers come forward for a meeting at the government palace. They were all given amounts that they had to pay for bribes. Cuervo asked to pay the largest. When some of the other tequila makers and some of the industrialists who lived in that district complained, Villa told them that if they didn't pay up, that he would erect a guillotine on the square and would carry out executions that would dwarf the French Revolution. Cuervo paid up. Not all of his neighbors did. They were not guillotined, but they wound up in front of firing squads within days. So after that, the industry essentially shut down from 1915 until 1917, when Carranza had taken control of the country and enacted a new constitution, and things stabilized enough to resume business. So it had a huge effect. And even when the industry resumed, Cuervo, I mean, this is where the cartel model came in. They were not only cooperating to try to get rebuilt, but Cuervo actually bought a steam engine and cars, bought time on the railroads that was exclusively for himself, and was frequently having to run the revolutionary lines in order to get his product from Guadalajara to Mexico City and Mexico City to the border. So it was not an easy thing to try to do. And as I said before, just as they were kind of breaking through, as the country was recovering, prohibition came into effect. So it was a complicated time for sure.
Well, speaking of the revolution, Dan Towler asks, this could be a toughie. Can you give a quick description of the Mexican Revolution, the timeline? Who was
Yeah.
opposing whom? What was it about? What changes resulted from it?
Yeah. So that is not an easy question to answer, but I can do that. So Porfirio Diaz was the dictator who the Cuervos Jose Cuervo's uncle and father helped bring to power in 1876 and 77. Um, and the Cuervos, some of how they were able to build their business before Jose was born was through their proximity to that power. But the Cuervos were in a complicated position, sometimes in favor, sometimes out of favor with Diaz. Jose, when he took over, tried to remain very close to Diaz. But the problem was that 30 years plus of dictatorship, all of the resources of the country and all the wealth of the country really accrued to a very small group of people who were in the inner circle of the president. And so even as the wealth of Mexico grew, the poverty of the populace also grew. And eventually everyone just wanted Diaz out so that there would be a possibility of liberalizing those industries and land in particular, so that there would be an opportunity for people to get ahead. When Diaz was eventually left the country, sensing that forces were lining up against him, Francisco Madero took over, led that revolutionary movement, and then took over as president. And he was very briefly in power before the U.S. ambassador helped Victoriano Huerta, one of the generals under Madero, to lead an insurrection against him and overthrow the government. Huerta took over as president and was briefly in power himself. And what I can say is this: after that point, there are many factions who are interested in unseating Huerta. When they finally succeed, they fought with each other for years to follow. Um, those forces are under a bunch of familiar names, especially Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza and Alvaro Obregón, and as well as some lesser known figures like Manuel Dieguez. But there were many competing forces that and historians argue about when to say the revolution actually ended. Generally speaking, you can draw a line either at 1917 or 1920, but there's been a movement in recent scholarship to talk about it extending, through the 1930s, because there are continual efforts at overthrowing the government. So it is not an easy history once you get past about 1914, because it is just constant turmoil.
Yeah, well done. Jerry put up a quote from Porfirio Diaz, a famous quote. Do you know what it is?
I don't see it. What is the?
Poor Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God.
Yeah, well, well,
Well,
the thing,
speaking of which, one of my questions is, what's the state of the industry today, and will tariffs come into play and have any effect?
yeah, for sure. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is fascinating about the industry now is that the old families, the ones that sort of banded together to form the cartel and get through um, the destruction of the revolution, they all emerge on the other side as the leaders of the industry to this day. Cuervo, Sausa, Herradura are still among the largest brands. The change that's occurred in recent years is that, first of all, there's been increasing, European ownership of those brands, big international conglomerates that have bought up those Mexican brands. And then there have been Americans that have founded brands like Patron and Casamigos that are now enjoying huge market share. So essentially, the industry today is divided between American owned brands and European owned brands. The one exception to that is Cuervo itself. The I mentioned that Jose Cuervo's nephew is Juan Beckman, the German consul in Guadalajara. He eventually inherited the company after Cuervo's widow died, and the company since then has passed down through the hands of a succession of men also named Juan Beckman. So there's Juan Beckman Wilkins, Juan Beckman Gallardo, Juan Beckman Bedell, and who still runs the company. And so they are, in many ways, the lone survivor as a Mexican owned brand, in in the industry and still have the largest market share. And I mentioned before, I want to mention Cuervo. I think it's fascinating. They were interested in selling off the company maybe 6 or 8 years ago. They were planning to sell the company, and Juan Beckman Vidal just simply couldn't do it. And the story goes that he just no-showed the meeting where he was supposed to sign the documents to sell the company, and decided instead to invest in the town and in tourism in a lot in the same way that Jose Cuervo did a century before. And so thanks to the Beckman investment and the Cuervo investment, there are now hotels and restaurants, and there's the train that Jose Cuervo first brought to town now runs out there carrying tourists on weekends. Um, and the town is flourishing, and is a beautiful destination. And the Cuervo distillery, they say that they get 1.4 million visitors a year who tour the distillery. So
Wow.
one of the other things that's happened with the tequila industry, especially the older brands, is that tourism has become a big part of what they do.
Hmm. And tariffs, any of
Oh, and the tariffs. Yeah, well, the tariffs pose a huge problem because many of especially the big brands, what you're trying to do is sell a volume product. And so if a bottle of Jose Cuervo retails at $20 a bottle, a 25% tariff that makes it suddenly a $25 bottle is something that potentially makes a consumer decide to buy something else. And so the one thing that Cuervo did was move a huge quantity of tequila across the border, knowing that the tariffs were coming, and it's stored in warehouses in the U.S.
hmm,
So it's already in tariff free. Um, but but it's still, for future planning, it has a huge effect because you don't know what the price point of your product is going to be, and therefore you don't know what the demand is going to be. I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it is a strange thing to impose a tariff on a cultural heritage product. By international agreement, you can't make tequila anywhere but in Mexico and in specific parts of Mexico. And so it's not as if imposing a tariff on tequila is going to encourage US production of tequila. It's not legal. By international law, it's not legal. So I, it'll be interesting going forward to see if there are carve outs, if there is some backing away, if this becomes part of the negotiation. Um, it's, I would say it's safe to say that it's a pretty unpredictable playing field. Um, and but I think in some ways it affects the large brands like Cuervo more than the others, just because it has such a kind of radical impact on what is intended as a kind of budget item.
yeah. Okay, well, I got to ask this question by Bob Nassau. How are the bats doing these days? Have they benefited from the survival of the tequila industry?
So so I'm
I'm not
glad.
sure what he's talking about, but
Well, I'm glad that we come back to that. But um, I'm really pleased to say that among the things that the industry has done is try to improve its sustainable growing practices. And part of that is by a number of smaller brands committing to allowing a certain percentage of their agave to go to flower so that the pollinating bats um, will be able to come in and improve the genetic diversity of the agave, but also it obviously helps the migratory bats if they are able to find food along their route. There's now a formal designation that is called bat friendly. There are bat friendly tequilas. Um, and I'm especially pleased to say that Rodrigo Medellin, the Mexican biologist who's leading that effort, what they are doing is attempting to restore the bat population by using the work that my dad did there in the 1960s as the benchmark. And so his research is really the foundation of the conservation efforts that the industry is undertaking now as they try to improve the bat populations, restore the bat populations.
Great. All right. Here's one from Dean again. I'm not sure what he's getting at here. Which families contributed to the bribes, I guess you were talking about, to avoid
Oh,
persecution? Or maybe
yeah.
this is going back to the Jose's ancestors, who were
Yeah.
pretty
Well,
bloodthirsty bunch, actually.
yeah, well, yeah. So the families that the prominent families in the Tequila Valley, um, coming into the Mexican Revolution, obviously the Cuervos and the Sausas. You also get a kind of complex of families that make up what we talk about as the Rosales family, but that family was kind of built through the matrilineal line, and so there's they're intermarried with the Martinez family and with the Ruiz family, uh, some others, and so um, but all of those were in the Ontiveros family. There are those are all represented in that meeting that was called by Pancho Villa in 1914. At the time, what was going on is that you would move your product to Guadalajara, and from Guadalajara distribute to the other cities of Mexico or to the border. And so they had all the tequila makers had businesses and distribution centers clustered around the train station in Guadalajara. And so that was great during peacetime for distribution. It was kind of a bad thing during the revolution because everybody would bring their troops into the city to occupy the city on the trains, and they would all disembark into the center around the train station, and all of the businesses that sat right around the train station, many of which were the tequila makers, were the most obvious targets. They would simply get off the trains and start demanding bribes from all of the big businesses that were there. And Cuervo had built and others had built to be close to the center of government power in Guadalajara also, but that meant that they were just a few blocks from the government palace, where the governor's mansion, the Mexican or the state Congress, and the state Supreme Court are all were housed. And so when they came in by train, the natural thing to do was head to the government palace to overtake things and hit all the businesses along the way. And Villa, in this particular instance, just demanded that all of those heads of their companies come for a meeting where the bribes were formally demanded. The thing that is truly remarkable is that there was so much concern about what was going to happen and the possibility that these business leaders would be killed, that the foreign consulates would they all sent people, representatives to that meeting to take notes. And and the French consul provides a very, very good transcription of the entire meeting that largely matches the notes of the German consul. And so it's a rare instance where there's a perfect kind of transcription that gives us a very clear view of what was happening in the room.
Okay. Thanks, Ted. This has been a great discussion. We only got a couple of minutes. You've done impressive work, and it's an exciting read. Um, I guess you're on the tour, virtual or otherwise, for a while. You spent 12 years on the book. What's next?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll see. I have a couple of things that I'm working on. I am interested in that border period, the period that follows the beginning of Prohibition, and have done some research and writing about that as a kind of follow up to this. I also, work as a journalist, and have been reporting on the meatpacking industry and about immigrant labor. And right now, as um, many of the workers who feed the country are being targeted by the new administration for deportation. It's been something that I've been looking at as a possible book project as well. So we'll see what happens next. These things rarely happen fast. I'm hoping the next one doesn't take 12 years. I have to tell you, I've been in New York for things this week, and my editor who um has been with me for a while and is we'll just say has been in the industry as a an editor for a number of years, told me, he's like, I look forward to the next book, but if you take 12 years this time, I'm going to be retired by the time you deliver the manuscript. So that's a little positive pressure for me to work faster this next time.
Well, good luck with that, and good luck with this one.
Thank you so much.
So we'll keep you posted for when the next literary cocktail hour rolls around, but most certainly put the live Brattleboro Literary Festival on your calendar for October 17 to 19, when we'll once again fill the streets and venues of the town with authors of all stripes, including Ocean Vuong, Adam Plunkett, Ada Calhoun, Heather Clark, Ben Shattuck, our own Tim Weed with a new novel, and many more. Thanks again to Ted, and in the spirit of the day, cheers.
Thanks so much.